Good morning. Am I on? How is everybody? The Huskers didn't lose. We're not in mourning. Well, I am honored to speak to you this morning. May my message be worthy of the one I represent. This is Pastor Appreciation Month. And if you really want to appreciate a pastor, try working on a sermon. It's not easy. Troy and I have talked about that in the past over the years, about teaching Sunday school. It's not easy working on a lesson and being ready to teach Sunday school week after week after week. Diane and I recently went to Alaska, and I'm going to take you on a little trip that'll include Alaska and Egypt. That sounds odd, I know. But we have a connection, and the connection is a man amongst us. We have a man among us this morning who has actually seen the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids, and that man is Mr. Arnie Horn. And I thought of Arnie recently when we were in Alaska. Oh my, that really washed out. That is Mount McKinley in Alaska. Rich and Donna Bell spent 40 days and 40 nights in Alaska. And I think they wanted to climb Mount McKinley, but they didn't bring their oxygen cylinders along. Mount McKinley is 20,320 feet in elevation. That's really high. Anyway, as Diane and I were riding the train from Fairbanks down to Anchorage, going through Denali National Park, and as I saw Mount McKinley, I thought of the Great Pyramids of Egypt and Arnie, and I thought of the verse that Hugh had recently covered in Romans. As you know, we've been going through Romans, and it wasn't all that long ago that Hugh covered Romans 9:17, which read for us this morning, which is a direct reference to the plague of hail that God brought upon Egypt. I found myself having to keep backing up. I was going to just start out and talk to you about the plagues, but to really fully appreciate the plagues and what God is doing here, you need to put the plagues in context. I found myself backing all the way up to clear back to Abraham, because God appears to Abraham, and he gives a promise to Abraham to make Abraham into a great nation. And then you have to go on from Abraham to Isaac and to Jacob. And in Genesis 35, God blesses Jacob. He tells him he'll make him into a great nation, and a company of nations shall come from him. In Genesis 37, we're introduced to young Joseph. He's age 17, and he has some dreams. And his family doesn't really appreciate his dreams. He says one day, "Hey guys, I dreamed that your sheaves bowed down to my sheaf." And they didn't take that very well. He said, "What? You really think we're going to worship you?" And then he had another dream. The sun, the moon, and the stars were bowing down to him. And Jacob, his father, didn't really appreciate that. He said, "What? Do you really mean to say that my mother and I and your brothers are going to bow down and worship you?" Well, that did happen. By the way, that is the Tanana River in Alaska. That is glacial melt, and that water is about 35 degrees. Well, let's talk a little bit about Joseph. Dean was talking about Joseph in Sunday school this morning. Joseph is one of my favorite biblical characters. He is one of the few people who started well and finished well. Very few can claim that. Well, as you know, Joseph's brothers hate him, and they sell him off. He's carried off to Egypt, and he gets hired or bought by Potiphar, an officer of the guard of Pharaoh. And in Genesis 39, we learn about how he works. He does his work well. That's one thing that impresses me about Joseph. And an application I see here for us is that we should do our work well also, to the point that our employer fully trusts us, and he knows that he can leave everything in our care. And Potiphar did. He trusted Joseph. He did his work that well. And I think it was during this time that he was working here, he was learning Egyptian. How do I know that Joseph learned Egyptian? Because I read that later when his brothers come down to buy grain. It says that Joseph was speaking through an interpreter to his brothers. So he learned Egyptian. Well, as you know, God allows Joseph to be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. He's thrown into the prison, and it had to have hurt, and he had to have wondered, why in the world, God? Why are you allowing me to be falsely accused? And yet God is with him. God prospers him in the prison even. And God, being the God of everything, including visions and dreams, causes the cupbearer and the baker each to have a dream. And God gives Joseph the ability to interpret those dreams. And Joseph says to the cupbearer, hey, would you do me a favor? Would you remember me? But he doesn't. The cupbearer forgets, and another 2 years go by. And Joseph had to wonder some more. Wow, God, are you still here? What are you doing? What's your plan? Why the delay? 2 years later, God causes Pharaoh to dream in Genesis 41. And God enables Joseph to interpret those dreams. And you have to start asking, what ifs? Well, what if Pharaoh never dreamed those dreams? Well, if Pharaoh had never dreamed the dreams, then Joseph wouldn't have had a chance to demonstrate the power of the Holy Spirit, and he may not have ever gotten elevated to second in command. But he did, because God caused that to happen. Anyway, Pharaoh was very impressed. This Pharaoh is not antagonistic toward God. In contrast to the coming pharaohs, this Pharaoh gives the credit to God. Pharaoh, even though he may not necessarily be saved or not necessarily believe in God, yet he respects God. He sees that God is working in Joseph. He elevates him to second in command of all of Egypt. Basically, Joseph is in charge of everything, day-to-day activities. And Joseph later in Genesis refers to himself as the father of Joseph. I think this Pharaoh, or a father of Pharaoh, this Pharaoh just loved him. I think he was taken in his family, and he acted, spoke like an Egyptian. And he marries Asenath, the daughter of Pharaoh, and has children by her. That picture is yet another one taken in Denali National Park in Alaska. Well, I'm sure that Joseph felt hurt and disappointed. Another setback because the cupbearer forgot him, and he's probably wondering, why? Why is God delaying? But I think the application here for us is we need to remember that even in the dark times, even in the hard times, God is still with us. He does not forget us. He does not abandon us or forsake us. And He is still working His plan. I covered some of that. Now we get to the point